The room went silent the moment she appeared at the top of the stairs. Red dress, chin high, not a single ounce of apology in the way she moved. Marco DeLuca had hired her for one night. A fake wife, a prop for a room full of men who wanted to see him weak. She was supposed to blend in. She was supposed to disappear into the background. Instead, every conversation in that ballroom stopped. He reached for her hand at the bottom of the staircase, looked up into her eyes, and in front of politicians, rival families, and every perfect woman in that room who had spent years chasing his attention, Marco DeLuca forgot this was supposed to be fake. Before we step inside that ballroom, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I pick my favorites for a shout-out in my next video. So if you want to hear your name, tell me your city, tell me what you're doing while you listen. Cooking, driving, winding down for bed. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Let's find out how a struggling event planner ended up on that staircase in the first place. Marco DeLuca stood at the window of his penthouse office, staring down at the city he had spent 15 years building into something resembling stability, and considered the fact that all of it could unravel over a single dinner. "Say that again," he said, not turning around. His consigliere, Anthony, shifted uncomfortably behind him. "Senator Whitfield is bringing his own security detail. The Kovalenko family confirmed attendance an hour ago, and the Japanese investors specifically requested to meet your wife." "I don't have a wife." "I'm aware," Anthony said. "That's the problem." Marco turned from the window, his expression unreadable, though the tightness in his jaw suggested exactly how unwelcome this particular complication had become. "Since when does anyone care about my marital status?" "Since Whitfield's people started asking questions about your stability," Anthony said. "There's a narrative building, Marco. Unmarried at 38. No permanent partner, no visible commitments. In certain circles, that reads as unpredictable. Unpredictable men don't get international investment. They get watched." Marco exhaled slowly, understanding immediately the trap being constructed around him. His organization had spent the last 3 years transitioning toward legitimate shipping contracts, real estate developments, the kind of respectable wealth that could survive scrutiny from men who wore suits instead of carrying guns. That transition required exactly the image Whitfield's people were now questioning. "The dinner is in 5 days," Marco said. 4, Anthony corrected. "And every eye that matters will be in that ballroom. Politicians deciding whether to back your infrastructure bids. Rival families deciding whether you're strong enough to leave alone. Investors deciding whether your organization is the kind of stable, boring, respectable operation they can attach their names to without risk. And you think a wife solves this?" "I think the appearance of a wife solves this," Anthony said carefully. "Someone stable. Someone who can hold a room. Someone who makes you look like a man, building a legacy, instead of a man building an empire he intends to burn down eventually." Marco moved to his desk, sitting heavily, rubbing a hand across his jaw as he considered the problem from every angle his mind could generate. He'd spent his entire adult life controlling variables, eliminating unpredictability, and now his own unmarried status had somehow become the single greatest threat to everything he'd built. "I'm not marrying anyone," he said. "Nobody's asking you to actually marry someone," Anthony said. "Just for one night. A dinner. Someone convincing enough to shut down the questions, sophisticated enough not to embarrass you in front of people who matter, and discreet enough to disappear afterward without complications." "You make it sound simple." "It should be simple," Anthony said. "There are a dozen women in this city who would kill for the opportunity. Models, socialites, women who've made it clear for years they'd welcome your attention." Marco's expression darkened slightly. "Those women want something from me. Photographs, access, leverage they can use later. I need someone who wants nothing, who has no interest in extending this beyond one night, who understands exactly what this is, and doesn't confuse it with something else." Anthony was quiet for a moment, studying his employer carefully. "There is someone," he said slowly, though she's not exactly who you'd expect. Explain. Sophia Reyes, event planner, runs a small firm that's been struggling since her biggest client pulled out 6 months ago. She's sharp, professional, and completely uninterested in your world, beyond whatever business transaction brings her into it. Why her specifically? Anthony pulled up a file on his tablet, sliding it across the desk. Because 18 months ago, she stood in front of a city council meeting and publicly called out Councilman Reyes, no relation, unfortunately for her, for accepting bribes to approve unsafe construction permits. Destroyed his re-election campaign with nothing but documented facts and absolute refusal to back down when his lawyers threatened her. Marco studied the photograph attached to the file. A woman with dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, standing at a podium with the kind of unshakable composure that couldn't be manufactured or performed. She sounds difficult, he said. Extremely, Anthony confirmed. She's also broke, professionally isolated, because half the city's elite consider her a liability after that stunt, and completely unconnected to anyone who might use this arrangement against you later. Marco continued studying the file, something calculating shifting behind his dark eyes. You're suggesting I hire someone difficult, broke, and professionally radioactive to play my wife in front of the most important people in this city. I'm suggesting, Anthony said, that you need someone unafraid. Someone who won't crumble under scrutiny, who won't flirt or perform or try to extract more from this arrangement than what's contractually agreed. Sophia Reyes has already proven she doesn't back down from powerful men who threaten her. That quality might be exactly what saves this dinner, rather than someone polished but ultimately fragile under real pressure. Marco closed the file, considering the strange logic of Anthony's suggestion. Every instinct honed by years of careful risk management told him this was reckless, unpredictable, exactly the kind of variable he usually eliminated before it could become a problem. But something about the photograph, the steady defiance in her expression, even as council members and lawyers surrounded her with threats, tugged at something he couldn't quite name. Get her here, he said finally. Today, if possible. I want to meet her before I decide anything. And if she says no? Then we find someone else, Marco said, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected, with the particular certainty that came from years of reading people accurately, that Sophia Reyes wasn't the type to say no to an opportunity that might solve her financial problems, provided the terms were negotiated on her terms, rather than simply handed down. He was, as it turned out, only partially correct. Sophia Reyes arrived at DeLuca Enterprises precisely on time. Not a minute early, not a minute late, a small detail Marco noted with something like approval as he watched her walk into his office with the composed confidence of someone who refused to be intimidated by marble floors or imposing views. "Mr. DeLuca," she said, extending her hand with brisk professionalism. "Your assistant said this concerns an event planning opportunity, though I'll admit the secrecy around the details has me curious. Sit down, Miss Reyes." She settled into the chair across from his desk without hesitation, crossing her legs, waiting with the patient attentiveness of someone accustomed to sitting through difficult negotiations. "I need someone to attend a dinner with me," Marco said, deciding directness would serve better than elaborate explanation. "This Friday, as my wife." Sophia's eyebrows rose slightly, though she didn't otherwise react with the shock he'd half expected. "Your wife. For one night," Marco clarified. "A performance. Convincing enough to satisfy certain political and business concerns about my stability, discreet enough to end cleanly once the evening concludes. And you're asking me specifically because you don't need anything from me beyond fair compensation," Marco said. "You have no interest in extending this into something more complicated, no history that would make this feel like anything other than a professional transaction." Sophia studied him for a long moment, something calculating moving behind her dark eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of his own careful assessments. You've researched me extensively. Then you know my firm is struggling, she said bluntly, which presumably factors into your assumption that I'd be desperate enough to agree to this. I assumed you'd be practical enough to consider it, Marco corrected. There's a difference. Something almost like amusement crossed her features. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, Mr. DeLuca, this sounds like a wealthy, dangerous man assuming a broke woman will do anything he asks if the price is right. Would that assumption be incorrect? It would be incomplete, Sophia said. I'm interested. I won't pretend otherwise, given my current financial situation. But I don't negotiate from desperation, and I certainly don't agree to arrangements without understanding exactly what I'm walking into. Marco leaned back in his chair, genuinely intrigued despite himself by her refusal to simply accept his framing of the situation. What exactly do you want to know? Everything, Sophia said. Who's attending? What's actually at stake for you? What happens if something goes wrong during this performance? And considerably more compensation than whatever number you were initially planning to offer. You haven't heard my initial number. I don't need to, Sophia said. You're a man who needs something badly enough to hire a stranger to play his wife in front of politicians and rival families. That desperation, however carefully concealed, means you'll pay considerably more than you initially planned to offer, provided I make it clear I understand my own value in this arrangement. Marco studied her, something sharpening behind his dark eyes that hadn't been present when she'd first walked into the room. Anthony had been right. This wasn't a woman who could be intimidated or manipulated through careful positioning. $50,000, he said, for one evening. 100, Sophia countered without hesitation. Given the risk of being photographed alongside a man whose business dealings apparently require this level of image management. 75. 90, Sophia said, and you cover any wardrobe, styling, and preparation costs separately from that figure. Marco felt something unexpected tug at the corner of his mouth, an almost smile he hadn't experienced in longer than he cared to examine. You negotiate well, Miss Reyes. I negotiate necessarily, she corrected. There's a difference between skill and survival. 90,000, Marco agreed, with wardrobe and preparation covered separately. But I need to understand something clearly before we proceed further. What's that? This is strictly professional, Marco said, his voice carrying deliberate emphasis. No expectations beyond what's contractually agreed. No confusion about what this evening represents. You play a role convincingly, we part ways afterward, and neither of us mistakes performance for something genuine. Sophia's expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes that Marco couldn't quite identify. I wasn't under the impression this was anything other than business, Mr. DeLuca. I don't need reminders about professional boundaries. Good, Marco said, though something in his own chest tightened slightly at her quick, unbothered agreement, an emotion he immediately dismissed as irrelevant to the transaction at hand. Then we have an arrangement. We do, Sophia confirmed, standing to shake his hand again, her grip firm and businesslike. I'll need details about the dinner itself. Guest list, dress code expectations, whatever backstory you'd prefer we maintain about our supposed relationship. My assistant will provide everything you need, Marco said, standing as well, though he found himself oddly reluctant to end the conversation so quickly. Friday evening, 7 o'clock. A car will collect you at 6. I'll be ready, Sophia said, already moving toward the door, with the same brisk confidence she'd entered with. She paused at the threshold, turning back with an expression that carried the first hint of genuine curiosity she'd shown throughout their entire negotiation. Mr. DeLuca, she said, why me specifically? You could have chosen any number of women who would have agreed to this arrangement without nearly as much negotiation. Marco considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer mattered more than he wanted to admit. Because I needed someone unafraid, he said finally. Someone who wouldn't crumble under the kind of scrutiny this dinner will bring. You've already proven you don't back down from powerful men who threaten you. Something shifted in Sophia's expression, surprise perhaps, at receiving an answer more thoughtful than she'd anticipated. That's considerably more flattering than I expected from a business transaction. I deal in facts, Miss Reyes, Marco said. Not flattery. We'll see about that, Sophia said, a hint of dry humor finally breaking through her careful professionalism. Once I'm standing in a ballroom full of people who've spent years perfecting the art of looking down on anyone who doesn't fit their particular standards. She left without waiting for his response, and Marco stood alone in his office for several minutes afterward, staring at the closed door, wondering why a simple business negotiation had left him considerably more unsettled than he'd anticipated when Anthony first suggested her name. He told himself it was merely curiosity about how she'd perform under pressure. Nothing more significant than professional interest in an unpredictable variable he'd chosen to introduce into an already complicated situation. He was, as he would discover over the following 4 days, lying to himself rather thoroughly. The boutique Marco had selected occupied an entire floor of a building on the city's most exclusive shopping street, the kind of place that operated by appointment only and didn't bother displaying prices because anyone who needed to ask couldn't afford to be there. Sophia stood in the center of the fitting room, surrounded by racks of gowns that probably cost more individually than her firm's entire annual revenue, feeling distinctly out of place despite the deferential attention of the 2 stylists assigned to her. Mr. DeLuca specified red, the older stylist said, pulling a gown from the rack with reverent care. He was quite particular about it. Did he specify why? Sophia asked, eyeing the dress with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He said it needed to command attention, the younger stylist offered. His exact words, if I remember correctly. Sophia raised an eyebrow but said nothing further, allowing herself to be guided behind a privacy screen where the stylists helped her into the first of several gowns Marco had apparently pre-selected based on criteria she wasn't entirely privy to. The 4th dress was the one that mattered. Deep crimson, structured through the bodice with delicate beading that caught the light, the fabric flowing generously over her curves, rather than fighting against them. Designed by someone who clearly understood how to dress a body like hers, rather than simply accommodating it as an afterthought. Sophia stepped out from behind the screen, and the room went momentarily quiet. Marco stood near the window, having arrived 20 minutes earlier to review final selections, his attention fixed on his phone until the stylist's sudden silence drew his gaze upward. Whatever he'd expected, it clearly wasn't this. His expression shifted. The careful, controlled neutrality he maintained during their business negotiations cracking slightly as his eyes moved over her, taking in the dress, the way it fit her exactly as intended. The confidence with which she stood, despite the obvious scrutiny. That's the one, he said, his voice rougher than usual. You haven't seen the back, Sophia said, turning slowly to demonstrate the low-cut design that dipped elegantly along her spine. Marco's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's definitely the one. Sophia caught her own reflection in the mirror, studying herself with the critical eye of a woman who had spent years navigating a world that rarely designed anything beautiful for bodies shaped like hers. The dress fit perfectly, emphasized curves she'd spent considerable energy learning to stop apologizing for, and made her look, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, genuinely stunning, rather than merely presentable. I look good, she said, more to herself than to anyone else in the room, though there was an edge of surprise in her voice that she hadn't intended to reveal. You look exceptional, Marco corrected, moving closer, his eyes still tracking over her with an intensity that made her skin warm despite her best efforts at professional detachment. That's not what I meant, Sophia said, though she found herself oddly flustered by the directness of his observation. I know exactly what you meant, Marco said, his voice quieter now, something unguarded slipping through his usual careful control. You're used to people looking past you, aren't you? Or looking at you and immediately calculating what you're not, rather than what you are. Sophia's breath caught slightly at how precisely he'd identified something she'd never voiced aloud to anyone, not even her closest friends. "That's a rather personal observation for a business arrangement, Mr. DeLuca." "Marco," he said, "if we're going to convince an entire ballroom we're married, you'll need to use my first name considerably more comfortably than you're managing right now." "Marco," Sophia repeated, testing the intimacy of it. "Fine, but you're deflecting from my point. You don't know anything about how people perceive me. I know you stood in front of a city council and destroyed a corrupt politician's career with nothing but facts and refusal to back down," Marco said. "I know you've been professionally isolated since then, because people who benefit from corruption don't appreciate being reminded that consequences exist. And I know that despite all of that, you walked into my office 4 days ago and negotiated better terms than 3 of my actual business partners managed last year." Sophia stared at him, genuinely startled by the specificity of his assessment. "You've done considerably more research than seems reasonable for a one-night arrangement." "I research everything that matters to my business," Marco said, though something in his tone suggested this particular research had extended beyond strict necessity. "You matter to Friday's success. Therefore, I researched you." "That's a very calculated way of avoiding whatever you were actually about to say," Sophia observed. Marco's expression shifted again, something almost vulnerable, flickering, behind his usual controlled composure. "I was about to say that you're the first person who's walked into that ballroom in years who won't be performing for anyone else's approval. Everyone else calculates their worth based on how powerful men perceive them. You've clearly stopped doing that entirely, probably years ago, and it shows in the way you carry yourself." Sophia felt something warm and unexpected bloom in her chest at the observation, quickly followed by suspicion at how easily he'd managed to disarm her careful professional distance. "Is this part of the performance we're preparing for, or are you actually saying something genuine?" "I don't perform outside of business necessity," Marco said. "I find it exhausting." That comment was entirely genuine, which I'll admit surprises me somewhat. The stylists, sensing the shift in atmosphere, quietly excused themselves to retrieve accessories, leaving Sophia and Marco alone in the fitting room with a tension that had nothing to do with their business arrangement and everything to do with something considerably more complicated developing between them. "We should focus on Friday," Sophia said, though her voice carried less conviction than she intended. "We should," Marco agreed, though he made no move to create distance between them. "Though I find myself considerably more curious about you than seems appropriate for a temporary business arrangement." "That curiosity isn't part of our contract," Sophia reminded him, though she found herself unable to fully mask the flutter of interest his words had sparked. "No," Marco agreed, finally stepping back, allowing professional distance to return between them. "It isn't. Perhaps we should discuss the specific terms again before Friday arrives, to ensure we both remember exactly what this arrangement is meant to represent." Sophia nodded, though something in her chest tightened slightly at the reminder, an unexpected disappointment she immediately suppressed with the same practical efficiency she'd used to survive every difficult situation throughout her career. "Tomorrow," she said. "We'll discuss the rules tomorrow. Tonight, I'd like to actually enjoy wearing a dress that costs more than my car, without worrying about contractual boundaries." Marco's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but came remarkably close. "Fair enough, Miss Reyes. Tonight, just enjoy it." She did, though she found herself distinctly aware, throughout the remainder of the fitting, of exactly how often his eyes returned to her when he thought she wasn't watching, and exactly how much that awareness unsettled the careful professional boundaries she'd been so confident about maintaining. They met the following afternoon in Marco's office, the atmosphere considerably more formal than the previous evening's fitting session, as though both of them had spent the intervening hours deliberately reconstructing the professional distance that had threatened to collapse entirely. "I've drafted specific guidelines," Marco said, sliding a document across his desk. "Rules to ensure we maintain appropriate boundaries throughout Friday's dinner and any necessary follow-up appearances." Sophia scanned the document, her eyebrows rising slightly at the extensive detail. You've outlined acceptable physical contact parameters. Hand-holding, when necessary for the performance. A hand at your lower back while walking. Nothing beyond what would appear natural for a married couple without crossing into anything that might complicate our professional arrangement. How thorough, Sophia said, unable to fully mask the dry edge in her voice. You've really thought this through. I think through everything, Marco said. Rule 2. We maintain separate residences throughout this arrangement. There will be no expectation of anything beyond the contracted public appearances. Obviously. Rule 3, Marco continued, his voice carrying the deliberate formality of someone determined to establish clear boundaries before circumstances could complicate them further. No genuine emotional attachment. This is a business transaction, Miss Reyes, regardless of how convincing our performance needs to be. I need you to understand that clearly, especially after yesterday's conversation. Sophia looked up from the document, meeting his eyes directly. Are you worried I'm going to fall for you, Mr. DeLuca? I'm establishing necessary boundaries, Marco said, though something in his tone suggested her question had landed closer to truth than he intended to admit. Because from where I'm sitting, Sophia continued, ignoring his deflection, it sounds like you're the one who needs reminding about professional boundaries, given how thoroughly you researched my background and how personally you seemed to take my comments yesterday about being overlooked. Marco's jaw tightened slightly. I'm simply ensuring we both understand the parameters of this arrangement. Then let's be clear about something, Sophia said, setting down the document and meeting his gaze with the same unflinching directness that had apparently drawn him to hire her in the first place. I'm not interested in developing feelings for a mafia boss who's hiring me to solve an image problem. I have a business to rebuild, a reputation to reconstruct after that stunt with Councilman Reyes cost me considerably more than I initially anticipated. I don't have room in my life for complications, however charming they might occasionally appear during wardrobe fittings. Something flickered across Marco's expression, disappointment perhaps, quickly masked by his usual careful control. Good, then we're aligned. Completely, Sophia confirmed, though the word felt slightly less certain than she wanted it to sound. Rule 4, Marco continued, returning to his prepared list with renewed formality. This arrangement concludes definitively after Friday's dinner, unless additional appearances become necessary for maintaining the narrative we're establishing. In that case, we'll negotiate separate terms for each occasion. How many additional appearances are we anticipating? That depends entirely on how convincingly we perform Friday, Marco said. If the evening goes well, if the political and business concerns are sufficiently addressed, this may conclude with a single dinner. If complications arise, we may need to maintain the appearance of marriage for considerably longer. Sophia absorbed this, understanding the practical implications even as something in her chest tightened at the possibility of extended proximity to a man who had already managed to unsettle her carefully maintained professional composure within a single conversation. I need to understand something, she said. What exactly is at stake for you Friday night? You mentioned political pressure, investor concerns, but I'd like specifics before I'm standing in that ballroom, performing a role I don't fully understand the stakes of. Marco studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his dark eyes as he apparently weighed how much information to share. My organization is transitioning toward legitimate business ventures, he said finally. Shipping contracts, real estate development, the kind of respectable wealth that requires stability and predictability to attract serious investment. Friday's dinner represents a crucial evaluation point for several parties who could either support this transition or actively work to undermine it. And an unmarried mafia boss reads as unpredictable. Precisely, Marco confirmed. Senator Whitfield in particular has expressed concerns about backing infrastructure bids connected to my organization without evidence of stability. A wife, even a temporary one convincing enough to satisfy public scrutiny, addresses that concern directly. What happens if Friday goes badly? Then years of careful work transitioning away from more dangerous elements of this business become considerably more difficult, Marco said, his voice carrying weight that suggested the stakes extended beyond simple business inconvenience. Rival families interpret weakness as opportunity. Political support evaporates. Investment opportunities that took years to cultivate disappear entirely. Sophia nodded slowly, understanding now the genuine pressure behind Marco's careful, controlled exterior. You're not just protecting your image, you're protecting an entire transition away from your father's world. Something shifted in Marco's expression, surprise at her perceptiveness, quickly followed by something that looked almost like respect. How did you know this concerns my father? Because men who inherit empires built on violence either become exactly like their predecessors or spend considerable energy trying to become something different, Sophia said. You've clearly chosen the latter, which means Friday's dinner isn't just business. It's personal, in ways you probably don't want to fully acknowledge. Marco was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made the careful boundaries they'd just established feel considerably more fragile than either of them wanted to admit. You're remarkably perceptive, Miss Reyes. I read rooms for a living, Sophia said. Comes with running event planning for people who spend more energy managing appearances than genuine substance. Then Friday should prove interesting, Marco said, given how many appearances you'll need to navigate simultaneously. I generally perform well under pressure, Sophia said, gathering the contract document and standing to leave. Though I'll admit, Mr. DeLuca, this particular pressure carries considerably higher stakes than anything I've previously managed. Marco, he corrected again, standing as well. Marco, Sophia amended, though something in the way she said his name carried more warmth than strict professional necessity required. I'll see you Friday evening. 6 o'clock, you said? 6 o'clock, Marco confirmed, walking her toward the door despite having no obligation to do so. Sophia, she paused at the threshold, turning back at the sound of her name spoken with unexpected gentleness. Thank you, Marco said, for taking this seriously, for understanding what's actually at stake, rather than simply viewing this as an easy paycheck. I don't do anything halfway, Sophia said. Even elaborate performances for mafia bosses trying to reinvent their public image. She left his office with those words hanging between them, and Marco stood alone afterward, staring at the closed door, uncomfortably aware that the careful rules he'd just established already felt considerably more difficult to maintain than he'd anticipated when he'd drafted them the previous night. 3 days remained until the dinner that would determine his organization's future. He found himself considerably more preoccupied with the woman who would be standing beside him throughout it than seemed reasonable, given everything genuinely at stake. The DeLuca estate had been transformed for the evening. Every chandelier blazing, white flowers cascading down the marble staircase, in arrangements that had cost more than most people's annual salary. Marco stood at the base of that staircase in a tailored black suit, his expression carefully composed for the benefit of the 200 guests already filling the ballroom below. He checked his watch. Sophia was late. Not by much. 90 seconds, perhaps. But Marco had spent his entire career understanding that 90 seconds could mean the difference between control and chaos, and his pulse ticked upward with each passing moment she failed to appear. Anthony materialized at his shoulder. Whitfield just arrived. He's watching the staircase already. I'm aware. The Kovalenko contingent seems less impressed. They're discussing something in the corner, probably wondering why a man of your reputation needed to marry so quietly, with no public engagement, no society announcement. Anthony. Just reporting the room, boss. Marco exhaled slowly, forcing his expression back into the careful neutrality that had served him for 15 years. Whatever doubts existed about tonight's arrangement, he couldn't afford to let them show now. Not with half the city's power structure watching his every gesture with the particular scrutiny reserved for men whose stability remained in question. A hush moved through the crowd before he heard anything himself. the particular quality of silence that meant something had captured everyone's attention simultaneously. Marco turned toward the top of the staircase. Sophia stood at the landing, one hand resting lightly on the marble railing, the crimson gown catching the chandelier light in a way that made the entire dress seem to breathe with movement. Her dark hair had been swept into an elegant style that exposed the line of her neck, her makeup subtle but striking, drawing attention to eyes that surveyed the room below with the calm confidence of someone entirely comfortable in her own presence. She didn't hesitate. She didn't glance around nervously seeking approval or reassurance. She simply began her descent, one measured step at a time, her chin level, her shoulders back, moving with the unhurried certainty of a woman who understood exactly how much space she was allowed to occupy and had decided, quite deliberately, to occupy all of it. The conversations around the ballroom faltered, then stopped entirely. Marco felt something shift in his chest as he watched her, a physical sensation he hadn't experienced in longer than he could accurately recall, something between recognition and revelation. He had seen countless women descend countless staircases throughout his career, all of them performing the same practiced elegance, the same careful calculation of angles and lighting. Sophia wasn't performing. She was simply, entirely, herself, and the effect proved considerably more devastating than any calculated performance could have managed. "My God," Anthony murmured beside him. "She's magnificent." Marco didn't respond, already moving toward the base of the staircase, drawn forward by something that had nothing to do with the careful business calculations that had brought them to this moment in the first place. He reached the bottom step just as Sophia arrived, extending his hand automatically, the gesture they'd rehearsed and discussed and contractually outlined suddenly feeling entirely different in execution than it had in theory. Sophia placed her hand in his. Marco looked up into her eyes, and something in that simple exchange of glances silenced the remaining whispers throughout the ballroom entirely. 200 guests, politicians and rival family members and international investors, all of them watching a moment that Marco suddenly, inexplicably, felt no longer belonged to any of them. "You're staring," Sophia murmured, her lips barely moving. The words meant only for him. "I'm aware," Marco said quietly, echoing his earlier exchange with Anthony, without fully registering the parallel. "Is that part of the performance?" Marco studied her face, the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the barely concealed amusement at having clearly rendered an entire room speechless through nothing more than confident presence and a well-fitted dress. "No," he said honestly, "that's not performance at all." Something flickered across Sophia's expression, surprise perhaps, quickly masked as she allowed him to guide her down the final step and into the ballroom proper, the assembled guests finally beginning to move again, conversations resuming with the particular energy that came from witnessing something unexpected. "Marco De Luca," announced a voice near the entrance, cutting through the remaining murmur, "and his wife, Sophia." The formal introduction sent another wave of attention rippling through the room, and Marco felt Sophia's hand tighten slightly around his own, the only outward sign of nerves she'd displayed since appearing at the top of the staircase. "You're doing perfectly," he murmured, leaning close enough that his words remained private despite the crowded room around them. "I know," Sophia said, though her dry tone suggested she was reassuring herself as much as accepting his compliment. Marco felt something that might have been a genuine laugh threatening to escape, quickly suppressed as Senator Whitfield approached with his wife trailing slightly behind, both of them wearing the careful, assessing expressions of people determined to evaluate exactly how genuine this marriage actually appeared. "Mr. De Luca," Whitfield said, extending his hand with practiced cordiality that didn't quite mask the calculation beneath it. "And this must be your wife. I don't believe we've had the pleasure." "Sophia," she said, extending her own hand with confident warmth. "It's lovely to finally meet you, Senator. Marco speaks highly of your work on the Infrastructure Committee." Whitfield's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly surprised by her easy familiarity with details that suggested genuine domestic conversation rather than hastily memorized talking points. Does he? I wasn't aware my committee work made for compelling dinner conversation. You'd be surprised what makes compelling conversation in our house, Sophia said, a hint of dry humor threading through her words that drew an unexpected laugh from Whitfield's wife. Marco has strong opinions about port regulation efficiency. It's either riveting or exhausting, depending on how many glasses of wine I've had. Marco watched, genuinely impressed despite himself, as Sophia navigated the exchange with an ease that suggested years of similar performances rather than mere days of preparation. She asked precisely the right questions, deflected precisely the right probing inquiries, and managed throughout to project exactly the kind of grounded, genuine partnership that Whitfield had apparently come specifically to evaluate. "Your wife is charming," Whitfield said to Marco, once Sophia had drawn his own wife into a separate conversation about charitable initiatives with the smooth transition of someone entirely comfortable managing multiple social currents simultaneously. "She's considerably more than charming," Marco said, watching Sophia across the small distance separating them, something in his chest tightening at the accuracy of his own observation. "How long have you two been married?" Whitfield asked, his tone carrying the particular casualness that suggested the question mattered considerably more than his delivery implied. "Not long enough for me to take her for granted," Marco said, the answer emerging with an ease that surprised him, given how carefully he'd rehearsed considerably more calculated responses to exactly this type of probing question. Whitfield studied him for a long moment, something in his expression shifting toward genuine reassessment rather than mere political calculation. "You seem different tonight, DeLuca, more settled." "I feel different," Marco admitted, the words slipping free before he'd fully considered their implications. Across the room, Sophia caught his eye briefly, something warm and knowing passing between them despite the crowd separating them, and Marco understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that whatever careful rules he'd established during their contract negotiations were already beginning to feel considerably less relevant than the reality developing between them throughout this single evening. The dinner had barely begun. He suspected, watching her navigate the ballroom with effortless confidence, that the real complications were only just starting. Dinner service began an hour later, and Sophia found herself seated at the head table between Marco and a woman introduced simply as Contessa Valentina, the wife of one of the evening's most influential rival family representatives. The Contessa's assessment began the moment Sophia settled into her chair. "That dress," Valentina said, her tone carrying the particular sweetness that generally preceded something considerably less kind, "is quite bold for someone of your figure. Very brave choice." Sophia smiled, recognizing immediately the type of veiled insult she'd navigated countless times throughout her career, particularly from women who mistook cruelty for sophistication. "Thank you," she said warmly, as though the comment had been offered in genuine admiration. "I find bold choices tend to work better than apologetic ones. Though I imagine that philosophy extends well beyond fashion, don't you think?" Valentina's smile tightened slightly, clearly having expected either flustered embarrassment or defensive anger, rather than confident redirection. "I suppose that depends entirely on what one has to apologize for." "Precisely my point," Sophia said, taking a measured sip of wine, before continuing smoothly. "I find apologizing for existing tends to be exhausting, and considerably less productive than simply existing well. But I imagine you already understand that, given how confidently you carry yourself this evening." The compliment, delivered with genuine warmth despite its pointed subtext, seemed to catch Valentina entirely off guard, her carefully constructed condescension deflating into something closer to grudging reassessment. Marco, seated on Sophia's other side, watched the exchange with barely concealed admiration, though he maintained careful neutrality for the benefit of watching eyes throughout the room. "You're handling her remarkably well," he murmured, leaning close under the guise of adjusting her wineglass. "She's not the first woman who's tried this particular strategy," Sophia said quietly. Diminish first, then wait for me to either crumble or retaliate defensively. Neither response gives her what she actually wants, which is confirmation that she's superior, Sophia said. I find refusing to give her that confirmation, while remaining warm enough that she can't accuse me of rudeness, tends to unsettle people considerably more than direct confrontation would manage. Marco felt something that might have been genuine admiration bloom in his chest, watching her navigate social combat with the same strategic precision he brought to business negotiations. The next challenge arrived 20 minutes later, in the form of a heavy-set man named Dmitry Kovalenko, whose family had spent considerable energy questioning Marco's stability throughout the preceding weeks. So, Dmitry said, settling into conversation with the particular bluntness of someone who valued directness over diplomatic nuance, Marco tells us almost nothing about how you two met. Forgive my curiosity, but in our world, such details matter considerably more than they might elsewhere. Sophia met his gaze steadily, understanding immediately that this question carried weight far beyond simple curiosity. We met through mutual professional circles, she said, the answer carefully vague, while remaining technically accurate. Marco struck me immediately as a man who understood the difference between building something sustainable and simply accumulating power for its own sake. And that appealed to you? Considerably, Sophia said. I've spent my career working with people who confuse temporary advantage with genuine strength. Marco's approach to his organization's transition suggested something more thoughtful than that. Dmitry studied her carefully, something in his assessment shifting toward genuine consideration rather than mere skeptical probing. You speak about his business with unusual sophistication for someone outside the organization. I pay attention, Sophia said simply. It's rather difficult not to, when sharing a life with someone who thinks as carefully about consequences as Marco does. Interesting, Dmitry said, though his tone suggested genuine reassessment rather than continued suspicion. Most wives in your position discuss charitable galas and social calendars, not organizational transitions and strategic consequences. I'm not most wives, Sophia said, a hint of dry humor breaking through her careful diplomacy. I imagine that's precisely why Marco chose me. The comment, delivered with confident amusement rather than defensive justification, drew a genuine laugh from Dmitry. The tension that had characterized their entire exchange finally beginning to dissipate into something closer to grudging respect. Marco watched the interaction unfold with something approaching wonder, understanding now precisely why he'd been drawn to hire someone with Sophia's particular reputation for refusing to back down under pressure. She wasn't merely performing the role of his wife. She was genuinely, effortlessly, dismantling every careful assumption the evening's most skeptical guests had arrived prepared to maintain. By the time dessert arrived, the atmosphere throughout the ballroom had shifted considerably, conversations flowing with genuine warmth rather than careful political calculation. Guests who had arrived prepared to scrutinize Marco's stability, instead finding themselves charmed by a woman who navigated their sharpest tests with effortless grace. You've been staring at me for the past 10 minutes, Sophia murmured, catching Marco's attention during a rare lull in conversation. I have, Marco admitted, not bothering to deny it. Should I be concerned? No, Marco said, his voice carrying an intensity that surprised them both. I'm simply trying to understand how someone can be this genuinely remarkable and remain professionally isolated because powerful people find you too unpredictable to embrace. Sophia's expression softened slightly, something vulnerable flickering behind her usual composed confidence. Being unpredictable isn't always a flaw, Marco. Sometimes it simply means refusing to shrink for other people's comfort. I'm beginning to understand that, Marco said quietly, his hand finding hers beneath the table, the gesture unplanned and entirely genuine, rather than performed for their watching audience. Sophia's breath caught slightly at the unexpected intimacy of the touch, though she didn't pull away, allowing her fingers to lace with his despite every careful rule they'd established during their contract negotiations. Across the ballroom, Contessa Valentina watched the small exchange with narrowed eyes, something calculating shifting behind her expression that suggested tonight's carefully orchestrated performance had triggered reactions considerably more complicated than either Marco or Sophia had anticipated when the evening began. The real test, Sophia suspected, watching Valentina's expression darken with something that looked dangerously close to jealousy, was still ahead of them. The dinner had moved into its final hour when Sophia excused herself to the powder room, needing a moment away from the calculated performance she'd maintained flawlessly for nearly 3 hours straight. She found Anthony waiting near the corridor when she emerged, his expression carrying an unusual seriousness that immediately put her on alert. "Miss Reyes, do you have a moment? Is something wrong?" "Not wrong," Anthony said carefully. "But there's something I think you deserve to know, given how well tonight has gone. Marco would likely prefer I stayed silent, but I've worked for that man for 12 years, and I think you've earned honesty." Sophia's stomach tightened with unease. "About what?" "About why he chose you specifically," Anthony said. "It wasn't only about your reputation for refusing to back down under pressure. That was part of it, certainly. But there's more. I'm listening." Anthony glanced around the empty corridor before continuing, his voice dropping lower. "Your father, Diego Reyes, does that name mean anything to you?" Sophia's breath caught. "My father died when I was 12. Construction accident, according to the official report, though my mother always suspected there was more to the story than anyone ever explained." "There was more," Anthony said quietly. 15 years ago, your father worked at a construction site that Marco's father controlled through several shell companies. There was an incident, a structural collapse that nearly killed Marco, who was 23 at the time, and touring the site against his father's explicit instructions. Sophia's hand rose to her throat, understanding beginning to crystallize with uncomfortable clarity. "My father saved him. Pulled him from beneath collapsing scaffolding at considerable personal risk," Anthony confirmed. "Suffered injuries himself in the process. Injuries that likely contributed to his death 8 months later, though the official cause remained listed as unrelated to the earlier incident. Marco knows this. Marco has known your identity since the moment I suggested your name for this arrangement," Anthony said. "He recognized your surname immediately, verified the connection within hours, and proceeded with hiring you anyway, fully aware of exactly who you were." Sophia felt something cold settle in her chest, the careful professional arrangement she'd believed herself navigating suddenly revealing itself as considerably more complicated and personal than she'd ever suspected. "Why didn't he tell me?" "I don't know," Anthony admitted. "Perhaps he wasn't certain how you'd react, learning that your late father's heroism connected you so directly to his world. Or perhaps," Sophia said, her voice hardening with sudden suspicion, "he thought I'd refuse this arrangement entirely if I understood the true reason he selected me." "There's something else," Anthony continued, his expression growing more serious. "Dmitry Kovalenko's questions tonight weren't entirely business-related curiosity. His family has been investigating you independently for the past week, ever since word leaked that Marco had hired someone for this dinner." "Why would they investigate me?" "Because they've discovered the same connection I just shared with you," Anthony said, "and they're using it as leverage, suggesting Marco's selection wasn't random business calculation, but something considerably more personal, evidence of weakness they intend to exploit." Sophia's mind raced, connecting pieces that suddenly formed a picture far more complicated than the simple business transaction she'd agreed to 4 days earlier. "This dinner isn't just about Marco's public image, is it?" "No," Anthony admitted. "There have been threats, Miss Reyes. Against you specifically, once your connection to Marco's history became known within certain circles. Bringing you here tonight, publicly claiming you as his wife, provides protection that wouldn't otherwise exist. He's using me as a shield." "He's protecting you," Anthony corrected, "though I understand why those might feel like the same thing right now." Sophia stood in the empty corridor, processing information that transformed everything she'd believed about the past 4 days, about Marco's careful attention during their wardrobe fitting, about the genuine warmth she'd sensed developing beneath his controlled exterior throughout tonight's performance. None of it had been random. "I need to speak with him," she said finally, her voice carrying steel, despite the emotional upheaval churning beneath her composed exterior. "Sophia," Anthony said, using her first name for the first time since they'd met. "Whatever complicated reasons brought you into tonight's arrangement, I've watched Marco throughout this entire dinner. Whatever began as calculated protection has become something considerably more genuine. I felt you deserved to understand the full truth, but please don't mistake his initial motivations for the entirety of what's developing between you now." Sophia nodded, though uncertainty still churned through her chest as she made her way back toward the ballroom, searching for Marco among the remaining guests. She found him near the terrace doors, engaged in quiet conversation with Senator Whitfield, though his expression shifted immediately upon noticing her approach, some instinct alerting him that something significant had changed. "Excuse us," he said to Whitfield, moving toward Sophia with obvious concern. "What's wrong?" "My father," Sophia said quietly, once they'd found relative privacy near the terrace entrance. "You knew who I was before you ever hired me for this arrangement." Marco's expression shifted, something guarded and pained crossing his features. "Anthony told you. He thought I deserved the truth. I was going to tell you," Marco said, though his voice carried the particular weight of someone who understood how inadequate that explanation sounded, given the circumstances. "I intended to explain everything after tonight's dinner concluded, once immediate danger had passed." "Danger," Sophia repeated. "Anthony mentioned threats. Against me specifically." Marco's jaw tightened, something protective and fierce shifting behind his controlled exterior. "The Kovalenko family discovered your father's connection to my history within the past week," Dmitry suggested, through channels I won't dignify by repeating precisely, "that eliminating you might prove an effective method of destabilizing my organization's transition." Sophia's breath caught, understanding now the full weight of everything happening throughout this evening. "You hired me not just for image management, but because bringing me here publicly, claiming me as your wife in front of everyone who matters, provides protection I wouldn't otherwise have." "Yes," Marco admitted. No attempt at deflection or softening the truth. "That was part of my calculation initially. Though I want you to understand something clearly, Sophia. Whatever began as strategic protection has become considerably more genuine than I anticipated when I first recognized your surname." "How am I supposed to trust that distinction?" Sophia asked, "when everything about this arrangement was built on a foundation you deliberately concealed from me?" Before Marco could respond, a voice cut through their private conversation with deliberate cruelty. "How touching," Contessa Valentina said, having apparently overheard enough of their exchange to construct her own devastating interpretation. "The mafia boss and his charity case wife, having a lover's quarrel in front of half the city's power structure." The words carried enough volume to draw attention from nearby guests, and Sophia felt the careful composure she'd maintained throughout the entire evening beginning to fracture under the weight of public humiliation building around her. "Charity case," Valentina continued, her voice carrying easily across the terrace, drawing the attention of at least a dozen nearby guests, including Dmitry Kovalenko, who watched the unfolding scene with obvious satisfaction. "Isn't that rather generous phrasing, given the circumstances? A dead construction worker's daughter, hired to play wife because Marco needed a convenient shield against threats his own poor judgment created." Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks, the careful confidence that had carried her through the entire evening threatening to crack under the deliberate cruelty of Valentina's words. Every eye in the immediate vicinity had turned toward them now, conversations stuttering to silence, as the scene threatened to unravel everything Sophia had spent hours carefully constructing. "That's enough," Marco said, his voice dropping into something dangerously quiet, though Valentina pressed forward regardless. apparently emboldened by whatever alliance she'd formed with the Kovalenko family throughout the evening. Is it, though? Valentina continued. Because from where I'm standing, this entire marriage appears to be exactly what several of us suspected from the beginning, a desperate performance by a man too unstable to secure genuine commitment, hiring someone whose only qualification is being connected to a debt he apparently felt obligated to repay. Sophia's mind raced, understanding that whatever she said next would either salvage or completely destroy everything the evening had accomplished. She could feel Marco tensing beside her, ready to intervene with whatever ruthless authority he commanded throughout his organization. But some instinct told her that his intervention now would only confirm exactly the narrative Valentina was attempting to construct. "Contessa," Sophia said, her voice carrying clear and steady, despite the audience now fully attending to their exchange. "I understand you're disappointed that tonight didn't unfold the way you'd hoped. I imagine considerable energy went into constructing whatever narrative you and Mr. Kovalenko intended to circulate about Marco's stability." Valentina's expression flickered with surprise at Sophia's composed response. "I'm simply stating facts, dear." "You're stating assumptions dressed as facts," Sophia corrected, "which is a distinction I imagine you understand perfectly well, given how skillfully you've navigated similar situations throughout your own marriage." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the small crowd, and Sophia pressed forward before Valentina could recover her footing. "My father died protecting a stranger from a construction accident that should never have happened," Sophia continued, her voice gaining strength as genuine emotion replaced her earlier uncertainty. "He didn't know Marco's name, didn't know his family's business, simply saw someone in danger and acted without hesitation, because that's who my father was. If Marco chose to honor that sacrifice by ensuring I had protection when threats emerged against my safety, I fail to see how that reflects poorly on either of us." "How convenient," Valentina said, though her voice carried considerably less confidence now, "that this heroic narrative emerges only after your connection became public knowledge." "It's not convenient," Marco said, finally speaking, his voice carrying absolute authority that immediately silenced the surrounding murmur. "It's simply true. Sophia's father saved my life 15 years ago. When I learned threats had emerged against her because of that connection, protecting her became considerably more important than any business calculation regarding tonight's dinner." He turned to face Sophia directly, ignoring the assembled audience entirely, his expression carrying an intensity that transformed the moment from public defense into something considerably more personal. "I should have told you everything immediately," he said. "You deserved that honesty from the beginning, rather than discovering it through Anthony in a hallway during the middle of dinner. I'm sorry for that failure. Genuinely, regardless of how tonight concludes." Sophia studied his face, searching for any trace of performance or calculation, finding instead raw vulnerability that matched nothing she'd witnessed from him throughout their entire 4-day acquaintance. "But I want everyone here to understand something clearly," Marco continued, his voice rising enough to carry across the entire terrace, deliberately including Valentina and Dmitri in his declaration. "Whatever began as strategic necessity has become something I refuse to diminish or apologize for. Sofia Reyes is remarkable, not because of any convenient connection to my past, but because she spent this entire evening demonstrating exactly the kind of strength and intelligence that makes her more valuable to me than any calculated arrangement could have anticipated." He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together with deliberate, public intimacy that left no room for continued speculation about the genuine nature of their connection. "This isn't a performance," Marco said, his eyes never leaving Sophia's face, despite addressing the surrounding crowd. "Whatever it began as, it isn't that anymore." Sophia's breath caught, understanding the weight of what he'd just declared publicly in front of the exact audience whose scrutiny had brought them together in the first place. Whatever careful boundaries they'd established during contract negotiations had just been demolished entirely, replaced by something considerably more genuine and considerably more dangerous to the professional distance she'd been struggling to maintain. Dmitry Kovalenko studied the exchange with narrowed eyes, clearly recalculating whatever strategy he'd hoped to execute through Valentina's public humiliation attempt. Interesting declaration, DeLuca. Though declarations are considerably easier than genuine commitment. Then perhaps you should stay for the wedding anniversary next year, Marco said, his voice carrying dangerous confidence, and witness exactly how genuine this commitment proves to be. The words hung in the air, a promise neither of them had discussed or planned, and Sophia felt her pulse quicken at the audacious certainty in his voice, the way he'd just extended their carefully contracted one-night arrangement into something considerably more permanent without any prior discussion between them. Valentina, recognizing her attempted humiliation had backfired entirely, offered a tight, insincere smile before retreating toward the ballroom's interior, Dmitry following with considerably less satisfaction than he'd displayed throughout the earlier portions of the evening. The surrounding guests slowly dispersed as well, conversations resuming with renewed energy, though Sophia remained rooted in place, staring at Marco with an expression that mixed genuine emotion with lingering uncertainty about everything he'd just declared. "An anniversary," she said finally, once they'd achieved relative privacy again. "That's a significant extension beyond our original one-night arrangement, Mr. DeLuca." "Marco," he corrected automatically, though something almost sheepish crossed his expression. "And yes, I suppose it was somewhat presumptuous of me to extend our arrangement publicly without discussing it with you first." "Somewhat," Sophia agreed, though her voice carried less irritation and considerably more curiosity than the word suggested. "Care to explain what exactly you're proposing, now that we're not performing for an audience?" Marco studied her carefully, something vulnerable and genuine, finally breaking through the careful control he'd maintained throughout their entire acquaintance. "I'm proposing," he said slowly, "that perhaps this arrangement doesn't need to remain temporary, if you're willing to consider something considerably more genuine than what either of us initially planned." Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs, understanding that the next words she spoke would determine considerably more than the conclusion of tonight's elaborate performance. They returned to the ballroom together, Marco's hand still laced with hers, and something had visibly shifted in the way the room responded to their arrival. Whispers followed them, but they carried a different texture now, curiosity rather than skepticism, admiration rather than calculation. Anthony intercepted them near the dance floor, his expression carrying poorly concealed satisfaction. "Whitfield wants a private word before he leaves, and the Japanese delegation has requested a follow-up meeting next week to discuss the shipping contracts formally." "That's good news," Sophia said. "That's exceptional news," Anthony corrected. "Whatever happened on that terrace, it worked considerably better than anything we'd planned." Marco's jaw tightened slightly. "It wasn't a strategy, Anthony." "I'm aware," Anthony said, something almost gentle in his tone. "Which is precisely why it worked." He excused himself to manage the remaining logistics of the evening, leaving Marco and Sophia standing near the edge of the dance floor as the orchestra transitioned into something slow and unhurried. "Dance with me," Marco said. "That wasn't part of the contract." "Nothing that's happened in the past hour was part of the contract," Marco said, extending his hand with quiet certainty. "I'd like to dance with my wife, Sophia, contract or otherwise." Sophia studied him for a long moment, weighing the genuine warmth in his expression against everything Anthony had revealed about the calculated beginning of their arrangement. Whatever complicated foundation had brought them here, something in his eyes now carried none of the careful business calculation that had characterized their first meeting. She took his hand. They moved onto the dance floor together, and Marco pulled her close, his hand settling against the small of her back, with the same careful, deliberate warmth he'd shown throughout the wardrobe-fitting days earlier, though now nothing separated the gesture from genuine feeling. "Everyone's watching," Sophia murmured. "Let them," Marco said. "I find I no longer care what conclusions they draw, provided the conclusion happens to be accurate." And what conclusion would that be? Marco's expression softened, something unguarded and honest replacing his usual careful composure. That I chose you, not because your surname connected conveniently to a debt I felt obligated to repay, not because your reputation for stubbornness solved an image problem I needed managed. I chose you because in 4 days you've become considerably more essential to my life than any calculated arrangement could have anticipated. Sophia's breath caught, the words landing with weight that transformed the evening entirely. Marco, let me finish, he said gently. I've spent 15 years building an empire, transitioning away from violence toward something legitimate, something that might actually mean something beyond mere survival. I've done all of it alone, Sophia, believing genuine connection represented a vulnerability I couldn't afford to indulge. And now I'm standing in the middle of my own ballroom, having just publicly declared feelings I hadn't fully acknowledged until the words were already leaving my mouth, Marco said, something almost bewildered beneath his usual controlled delivery. And I find I don't regret a single word of it. The music continued around them, other couples filling the dance floor, though Sophia felt as though she and Marco existed in some separate space entirely, insulated from the 200 guests still watching their every movement with renewed curiosity. This is considerably more complicated than one dinner, she said. Considerably, Marco agreed, though I find myself remarkably unbothered by that complication, given the alternative would mean pretending tonight represented nothing beyond contractual obligation. You realize what you've done, Sophia said, publicly claiming this marriage as genuine, in front of Whitfield, in front of the Kovalenko family, in front of every investor whose decisions depend on believing your stability is real rather than performed. I do. There's no walking that back now. I have no intention of walking it back, Marco said, his voice carrying absolute certainty, unless you tell me that's what you want. If tonight's declaration was premature, if you'd prefer we return to the original arrangement and conclude this after tonight, I'll respect that decision entirely, however difficult I might find it. Sophia studied his face, searching for any trace of calculation or performance, finding instead the same raw vulnerability she'd witnessed on the terrace, magnified now by the public commitment he'd just made without any guarantee she'd choose to honor it. I need time, she said honestly. This began as a business transaction 4 days ago, Marco. I need to understand what you're actually offering before I decide whether tonight's declaration becomes something I choose to embrace rather than simply survive. That's fair, Marco said, though disappointment flickered briefly across his expression before he carefully masked it. Take whatever time you need. They finished the dance in comfortable silence, and as the song concluded, Marco guided her from the floor, his hand still resting protectively at her lower back, despite the uncertainty hanging between them. Whitfield approached as they exited the dance floor, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who'd witnessed exactly the reassurance he'd come seeking. DeLuca, I believe we can proceed with the infrastructure discussions we'd previously tabled. Your wife's charm aside, I've rarely witnessed such genuine connection between two people navigating a room this politically complicated. Thank you, Senator, Marco said, though his eyes remained fixed on Sophia rather than the man whose approval had originally motivated this entire elaborate performance. Congratulations, Whitfield added, extending his hand toward Sophia. Whatever brought you into Marco's life, Mrs. DeLuca, I suspect it's considerably improved his prospects beyond mere political optics. Sophia accepted the handshake graciously, though something about the title Mrs. DeLuca, spoken with such casual certainty, sent an unexpected shiver through her chest. As Whitfield moved toward other guests, Sophia turned to Marco, understanding that whatever complicated feelings existed between them, the business stakes that had originally brought them together had been thoroughly, successfully resolved. You got what you needed tonight, she said quietly. I got considerably more than I anticipated needing, Marco corrected, his voice carrying weight that suggested his answer extended well beyond mere business success. The remaining guests began their gradual departure as the evening concluded, and Sophia found herself standing beside Marco, near the grand staircase where the entire evening had begun. Uncertain what came next, but acutely aware that nothing about tonight had unfolded the way either of them had originally planned. The estate had emptied by midnight, the last guests departing with lingering glances toward the couple who had dominated the evening's conversation. And Marco walked Sophia to the terrace overlooking the gardens, the noise of the departed party finally settling into quiet. "You said you needed time to understand what I was offering," Marco said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them since the last guests departed. "I'd like to try explaining, if you're willing to listen." Sophia settled onto the stone bench overlooking the moonlit gardens, gesturing for him to join her. "I'm listening." Marco sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, though he maintained enough distance to respect whatever boundaries she might still need. "When Anthony first suggested your name, I researched you extensively. As I mentioned, I discovered your father's connection to my past almost immediately, and I'll admit, my initial motivation for hiring you carried complicated layers beyond simple business necessity." "Guilt," Sophia said. "You felt guilty about my father's sacrifice." "Partially," Marco admitted, "though it was more complicated than simple guilt. I've spent 15 years wondering about the man who saved my life, wondering what happened to his family after his death, wondering whether I owed some debt I'd never properly acknowledged. When your name appeared in Anthony's research, I recognized an opportunity to address that debt while simultaneously solving my immediate business problem. That's a rather calculated origin for whatever this has become." "It is," Marco agreed. "I won't pretend otherwise. But Sophia, within an hour of meeting you in my office, watching you negotiate terms with more confidence than most seasoned business partners manage, the calculation began shifting into something considerably more genuine." Sophia studied his face in the moonlight, searching for any remaining trace of performance. "When exactly did that shift happen?" "When you told me you don't negotiate from desperation," Marco said. "When you looked at everything I represented, the danger, the wealth, the power, and treated all of it as simply factors to be negotiated rather than something to be intimidated by. I've spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who either fear me or want something from me. You did neither." "I wanted the money," Sophia pointed out. "You wanted fair compensation for a legitimate service," Marco corrected. "That's considerably different from the desperate, calculated attention I usually receive from people hoping to extract advantage from proximity to my world." Sophia considered his words carefully, understanding the genuine distinction he was drawing. "And tonight? Everything you said on the terrace, the declaration you made in front of Whitfield and the Kovalenko family?" "Every word was true," Marco said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. "I chose you tonight, Sophia, not because of contractual obligation or calculated business strategy, but because somewhere between your negotiation 4 days ago and your performance tonight, I found myself genuinely, completely unwilling to let this arrangement end as a simple business transaction." "That's a significant admission," Sophia said softly. "It's the truth," Marco said. "Whatever you decide moving forward, I needed you to understand that clearly. This isn't about protection or image management anymore, though both of those things remain genuinely important. This is about the fact that I haven't stopped thinking about you since you walked into my office, and I don't particularly want to start now." Sophia felt something warm settle in her chest, the careful professional distance she'd maintained throughout their entire acquaintance finally, completely dissolving. "I came into this arrangement needing money to save my firm," she said. "I never anticipated needing anything else." "And now?" "Now," Sophia said, turning to face him directly, "I find myself considerably more interested in what happens next than seems reasonable, given we've known each other less than a week." Marco's expression shifted, hope replacing the careful uncertainty he'd maintained throughout their conversation. "What are you saying, Sophia?" "I'm saying," she said, reaching for his hand with the same deliberate confidence she'd shown throughout the entire evening, "that perhaps this doesn't need to end tonight. Perhaps we discover together what happens when a calculated arrangement becomes something neither of us anticipated needing. Marco's fingers laced with hers, his expression carrying genuine relief and something considerably warmer beneath it. I should tell you, he said, that I meant what I said to Kovalenko. About the anniversary. That's rather presumptuous, Mr. DeLuca. Marco, he corrected, though warmth colored the reminder rather than his earlier formal insistence. And perhaps it was presumptuous, but I find myself entirely willing to work toward making that presumption a genuine reality. If you're willing to consider it. Sophia studied him in the moonlight. This man who had hired her as a calculated business solution and somehow, impossibly, transformed into someone she genuinely wanted to know beyond the confines of their original arrangement. I suppose, she said, a hint of her familiar dry humor breaking through the emotional weight of the moment, that stranger things have happened than a plus-size event planner accidentally falling for the mafia boss who hired her as fake arm candy. Considerably stranger, Marco agreed, his mouth curving into the genuine smile she'd only glimpsed a handful of times throughout their brief acquaintance. Though I'd argue you were never merely arm candy, Sophia. You were the only real thing in that entire ballroom tonight. He leaned forward, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she chose, and when she didn't, he closed the remaining distance between them, kissing her gently beneath the moonlight, while the estate's gardens remained quiet witness to a transformation neither of them had anticipated when this elaborate performance began. So, Sophia said, once they'd parted, her voice carrying warmth that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine feeling. Does this mean I need to renegotiate my contract? Marco laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded in a way that transformed his entire face. I think, he said, pulling her closer, we can discuss considerably better terms than anything either of us originally imagined. Outside the estate, the city continued its endless rhythm, unaware that within these gardens, a business arrangement built on calculated necessity had transformed into something neither party had planned for, but both, remarkably, had chosen to embrace completely.